Friends, depending on the I and visible forms, I consciousness arises. The combination of the three is contact. When with contact as condition, feeling arises. What one feels, one perceives. What one perceives, one thinks about. What one thinks about, one conceptually proliferates. With what one conceptually proliferates as the source, a perception and naming associated with conceptual proliferation assail a person with regard to past, future and present visible forms cognized by the eye. The same is said of the other five senses, namely ear, nose, tongue, body, mind organ. Okay, this is represented in this diagram here. First of all, it says that eye and forms come together and you have eye consciousness, and this whole thing is called contact. The confluence of I, forms and I consciousness is called contact. And then that leads to feeling and perception. Feeling and perception, or Vedana and Sanya, they actually arise together. I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about the five khandhas, that the four khandhas actually arise simultaneously. Although we talk about Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana, they actually arise simultaneously. And I often like to give the example of, or simile of, a bowl of bobo cha-cha. Alright, and in a glass bowl of bobo cha-cha is made of various ingredients, right? It depends on where your attention is directed to. If you direct it to, for example, something yellow there, you see is sweet potato, right? You direct it to something else, grayish, you see that it's yam. Alright, you direct it to something else, and you might see that it's sago. And then direct it to something else, you might see that it's santan. Okay? So, it's the same. They're all there together, but it depends on what your mind is paying attention to. In the same way, when these four aggregates arise, sometimes you will notice the Vedana, sometimes you will notice the Sanya, sometimes you notice the volition, sometimes you notice the consciousness, the bare cognition. Okay? So they actually affect one another. Feeling and perception, they affect one another. It depends on whether you're a feeler or a thinker. Okay? If you're a thinker, then probably your perception will take the lead and influence your feeling. If you're a feeler, probably your emotions, your feeling will influence your perception. Right? Not sometimes they might arise simultaneously, and it depends on where you are mind is directed to. So when these two combine, they will give rise to thinking. Then when you start thinking, then you will start to proliferate, make the story bigger and bigger and more detailed, and eventually reckonings based on proliferations and perceptions of past, future and just arisen forms will take over and obsess you. So initially it is as though you are doing the feeling, the perception, the thinking, and then in the end the thoughts assail you and make you the victim. So you are now obsessed by your thoughts, rather than you doing the thinking. Now you have no control anymore. It is your thoughts that are controlling you. Right? So that's how the whole perceptual mechanism works. It's even worse when it comes to the mind, because all the stories occurs in the mind door, not at the five sense doors. So it's the same with mind. Dhammas here means anything, any thought, any idea, any perception, any assumption that you form in your mind, that will lead to feeling and perception. And that feeling and perception will combine to bring about thoughts about what you feel, about what you perceive. And if your perception is not correct, and you still hold on to it as though it was true and correct, and then you keep on thinking and proliferate, and then in the end you become a victim of your own obsession, your own obsessive thoughts. It all sounds very simple, but it is very, very difficult to penetrate. A lot of us cannot really see that we have become victims of our own obsessive thoughts. including beliefs, assumptions, expectations. When I was a student in university, before I renounced the world, at that time I had been introduced to Buddhism, and I was particularly enthralled by the Four Noble Truths. I did not receive any proper training in meditation at that time. I sort of somehow learned to look at my own mind and to see how whenever I felt disappointed or frustrated, I would look at the cause. Why do I feel disappointed? Why do I suffer? And I could see very clearly that it's due to clinging, attachment to something. Particularly in the world, we are so attached to our expectations of what others are supposed to do, right? And when they don't fulfill our expectations of them, who suffers? You are the one who suffers, isn't it? Particularly if you are somebody like who you are a perfectionist like me, very, very perfectionist, want things to be done in this way, in a proper way, in a perfect way, in the best way. And then, of course, not everybody is like me. And when they don't perform according to my expectations, you know how I feel? Feel very, very frustrated, very unhappy, very, very upset. So because then the Four Noble Truths became very real to me. Because every time I suffer, I look at it, it's because of my attachment to expectation. So I was actually watching my mind even before I started proper meditation, without knowing it, And that's sort of when I decided to renounce the world, and I went to MBMC, and I wrote a letter to apply to become a monk. Passed it to Venerable Sujivo at that time. He was a bhikkhu, and he read the letter, and then he sort of started to snigger because I said I understood the Four Noble Truths. I mean, to them, when you say understand the Four Noble Truths, it means that you have become an Arya. I didn't think that I was an Arya, but I understood the Four Noble Truths in my own way. That's why it was enough for me to renounce the world. Or else if I had not understood suffering and the cause of suffering, I would still be there. Creating even more suffering for myself and others. So this is a very, very important principle. A lot of our suffering comes from our perceptions and our feelings. So don't just watch thoughts as thinking and push them away, Keep on watching thoughts and then keep on looking at them and try to maintain composure throughout your daily life by practicing this Dhammanupassana under the six sense basis, what I call open awareness. Now, this is a bit different from focused awareness. In focused awareness, you just focus your attention on one particular object, a breath, or rising and falling, or metta, or the 31 parts, the 31 the skeleton or whatever. In open awareness, I don't call it unfocused awareness. It's the opposite of focused awareness, because you're not focusing on only one particular stationary object. And yet it's not unfocused, because you're actually focusing on the mind. And the mind is changing all the time due to different stimuli from all the six senses. So I call it open awareness in the sense that you open up your awareness to be aware of the six senses, particularly the five senses, and how the mind reacts or responds to the senses. Okay, so the principle is you try to try to anchor your mind first, because there are a couple of principles you need to understand. Number one is that the five senses can only take present objects, right? You can only see something which is right in front of you right now with your eyes, right? And so same for the other senses. But what you saw yesterday, you can recall with your mind, right or not? Can any of you recall the group session that we had last night in JGS? Yeah, the moment I say it, you can recall in your mind, okay? But you cannot see with your eyes. All right? So the five senses can only take present objects. That's one principle you need to understand. The mind sense or the mind door can actually take objects of the past, the present, as well as the future, as well as time-freed objects, just fantasies and imagination, and even beyond that, and take Nibbana as object. Now, another feature of the mind or consciousness is that it's object dependent. Right? Eye consciousness can only arise when there is an eye object. Right? Not mind consciousness can only arise when there is a mental object. Right? Okay, so if the mental object is a thought connected with your worldly affairs, and that thought is not something productive, it's an idle thought, it doesn't really help you at all, it's just useless chatter in your mind. Our minds are very unruly. Whenever you see somebody, there's always some criticism going on in the back of the mind. She shouldn't have combed her hair this way this morning, it looks ugly. You shouldn't wear that dress, and that blouse and that skirt doesn't match, it's the wrong color. Or things like that, Automatically when you look at something, your mind will start to comment already, right or not? Just imagine, if somebody invented a mind amplifier, how embarrassing it would be. Everybody's thoughts are amplified, Okay, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep a watch on the mind all the time, and try to catch our thoughts so that we don't get involved in those idle thoughts, unproductive thoughts. All right. So in order to do that, you have to first of all anchor your mind, because the mind, the nature of the mind, the habit of the mind is to think. Most people are not aware of their present activities. When you are walking to the car park, when you are driving, what are you doing? Most of the time you're thinking, right? You're thinking of some interesting idea, or you're thinking of what you have to do in the future, or you're thinking about something that made you upset, and you're trying to think. You're living up in your brain most of the time, not with what is happening at the senses. Right? So now we are trying to train you to program your mind to stay more with the senses, and so that you have a reference point. Once your mind is anchored on the five senses, then the moment it's not with the five senses, you know that it's not there. And then you can know, oh, it's not there, what is it doing? What do you think it's doing? Probably thinking, right? The moment you realize it's thinking, then you can catch the thought and look at it. What is it thinking about? Right? And then you can catch the intention, and before the thought proliferates, you can stop it and then come back to the present moment. Alright? Present moment means being with your senses. Okay, so that is the principle of it. Is that present here is used in a conventional sense. Like I said, sati or mindfulness always takes the past object, but here is the immediate past. What you see, hear, smell, taste happens first at the sense doors, and then mindfulness takes its object immediately after that. So that is what we are aiming, trying to live in the present, meaning being with the immediate past, so that the mind does not get lost in thoughts and proliferations about idle things. Okay? So this is the basic principle.